Question 17 in the review asks us to find a polynomial with the zeros as follows. So 0 is a 0 of multiplicity 2, 4 is a 0 of multiplicity 1, and 2 minus I is a 0 of multiplicity 1. So I'm going to write my zeros down. I have x equals 0, and that has multiplicity 2. I have x equals 4. If it has multiplicity 1, I'm not really going to note that. And I have x equals 2 minus I. Again, multiplicity 1. Now, I do have one additional 0 because I know that all imaginary zeros occur in conjugate pairs. Because 2 minus I is a complex or imaginary 0, I will have to also have its conjugate pair, even if they didn't tell me. So I know I also have 2 plus I as another 0. I must have these two in pairs. Whenever I have one, I have its conjugate. All right, so now we're going to get the factors for each of these. So my polynomial f of x is going to be equal to my first 0 here, x minus 0. It's already equal to that 0, so my factor, which would be x minus 0, is really just x, right? My first factor is just x. But that factor has multiplicity 2, so I get that factor twice. So I get x times x, or x times x is x squared. So I'm going to have x squared for my first factor because I have x equals 0 with multiplicity 2. Now, the next factor coming from the x equals 4, if I subtract the 4 from both sides, that would give me x minus 4. And then the next factor coming from the x equals 2 minus I, I'm going to subtract that 2 and add the I over. So I would have x minus 2 plus I. And then the last factor, subtract both the 2 and subtract the I. That will give us x minus 2 minus I. So it says give my final answer in expanded form. So I'm going to have to expand this all the way out. Even if I wanted to leave it in factored or expanded form, I would definitely want to multiply out these two together because they have that imaginary component. I wanted to multiply those two things together first anyway here, so let's do that. So my polynomial, I'm actually going to leave this part of it alone. I'm going to copy and paste it, and we're going to start working on this part. So I'm going to start with the x. When I multiply x times x, I get x squared. When I multiply x times negative 2, I get negative 2x. Then x times negative I will be negative ix. That finishes this x. It's been multiplied by each of these three things. Now we're going to move on to the negative 2 times each of these three things. So negative 2 times x, negative 2x, negative 2 times negative 2, positive 4, negative 2 times negative I plus 2i. That finishes the negative 2, and now we're going to multiply by this positive I, each of those three things. So I'm going to have I times x, I'm going to have I times negative 2, negative 2i, and I'm going to have an I times a negative I, giving me a negative I squared. So all of that, not yet simplified, is the result of multiplying those two trinomials together. I should have 9 terms in the middle from these 3 terms times these 3 terms. Then we're going to simplify. So once again, I'm just going to copy, paste that part of it. I'm not changing that. I'm going to work on simplifying in here. There's only one x squared term, so I'm going to keep the x squared term. I have a negative 2x and another negative 2x, so that's going to add up to a negative 4x. And then my negative ix and my positive ix terms, those are going to cancel. So I add those guys to 0. And my 2i and my negative 2i, those are also going to cancel, right? Those are also going to add to 0, so we'll cross those out as well. So it looks like x squared minus 4x, I'm going to have this plus 4 right here. And then I'm going to have this minus I squared term from the end. Okay, so those are all the terms I get once I cancel out the ones that are same but opposite sign. It's not quite simplified, almost, so I can copy just about all of it the piece that I'm going to simplify right here is that negative I squared. I know that I is the square root of negative 1. So if I square the square root of negative 1, right, I is the square root of negative 1. If I square that, the square and the square root undo each other, and I get negative 1 back. So here I would have negative 1, or plus 1 when I simplify the signs, right? Negative times negative 1 is going to be positive 1 for that piece. Okay. So I have, oops, I didn't get that. I have 4 plus a 1 here, so I have a plus 5. And now if I was looking to get the simplified factored form, which is actually not my goal here, that would be it though. That would be the simplified factored form. I do need to continue and expand this because my goal is to get the answer in fully expanded form. So let's keep going. I like to save my monomials for last. So next I'm going to multiply my binomial by my trinomial. So let's do that. Keep that the same. And multiply, copy that on purpose. Okay, so now I'm going to multiply this x times this x squared. So that would give me x to the third. Then the x times the minus 4x, negative 4x to the second. Then the x times the 5 plus 5x. So if I look through that again, that should finish x's job. X times x squared is x cubed, x times 4x, x times 5. Now we move on to the negative 4 portion. And I'll put negative 4 times each of those things on the inside. So it's negative 4x squared. Then I have negative 4 times negative 4, positive 16x. And last, negative 4 times 5 is minus 20. Okay, almost there. We need to combine our like terms. So I see that here I've got a negative 4x and a negative 4x. So all together, that'll be a negative 8x, right? And then here I have a 5x plus a 16x. So altogether, that'll be a 21x when I add those together. Now my trinomial times my binomial has been simplified. I actually have 4 terms now on the inside there. And one last step, we need to multiply this monomial term, this x squared, into each of these. Okay, so we'll finish that up. F of x equals x to the second times x to the third is x to the fifth. X to the second times negative 8. X to the second is negative 8x to the fourth. Plus 21x to the third. 2 and 1 more makes 3. And minus 20x to the second. So altogether, that should be my final answer in its expanded